Welcome. This is the Discovering the Blue Hour author writing podcast. On today's episode, we will be talking about how I, Jasenia Cheyenne, started writing during the Blue Hour and my journey through the first draft. So stay tuned. Hi, welcome back. This is Jasenia Cheyenne, and you're listening to Discovering the Blue Hour podcast. This is an author writing podcast where every week I will be talking about writing topics pertaining to my work in progress book during the Blue Hour. So if you like learning about world building, character backstories, and POV, this is the place to listen to them. So let's get started. This first episode is basically how I got started writing the work in progress novel. And let me tell you, it's been a very long journey, and I'm not finished yet. This book series is simply summed up in one sentence about a girl who discovers she was born a werewolf. Yes, I know, before you write me off and say, oh, not another werewolf novel. Yes, my novel is another werewolf novel. And yes, I know werewolves have been overdone, but compared to vampires, I would say not enough. Hear me out for a second. Over the years, vampires have been remade to experience all kinds of things, revamped with each generation, and they are still trending to this day. I could go on and on about vampires, but that's not what my book is about. My book is about werewolves, shapeshifters, whatever you want to call them. This is just my opinion, but I feel werewolf mythology hasn't been done enough. Whenever they are written or filmed, the wolves are always the same, howling at a moon, afraid of silver, or second to other supernatural creatures. The only show I could say came close to being different with werewolf mythology is, you know that show Teen Wolf? Yeah, that's the show. They're the ones that came close enough to like being different. But that's a whole nother topic. And I want to discuss it, but I want to discuss it on another episode. My werewolves, I want it to be different. I want it to be different. I want it to be new, fresh, something new and fresh. And I know they always say that there's nothing new and fresh about writing. You've heard that before. I've heard that before. Like everything, the plots are recycled, but I want to attempt to write something new and fresh, and this is my attempt at that. And I'm really excited about it. When I was working on my research and the process that I was going through, working with the research and working on my first draft, I was so I was having fun. I was giddy. I was happy. I was so passionate about it. And I don't care what anybody says. There's no such thing as being over passionate about your writing or filmmaking or artwork. When you're into your work, you're into your work. When I tell you I'm into this series, I'm really into it to the point. If I have to keep on writing it over and over again just to get it right, I'll do that. So now that you know that my book is a simple premise about a girl who discovers that she's a werewolf, let me tell you a little bit about how I came up with that premise versus where it is now. So, it all started when I was in art college in 2007 in my first screenwriting class ever. One of the best, I might add, and one of the best instructors as well. So, let me go on. 2007 is at this time where, the Twilight book started to blow up, and that's the year they started to cast the movie and everything. Well, the actual movie didn't come out until 2008. Now, I was reading this book way before 2007 or 2008, all the way back when it first came out in 2005. I was like in my last year of high school. This is like pre-Twilight time, movie time, pre-Twilight movie time. And so when I first read it, I was like, wow, this would make such a great movie. And at the time I thought it was a great book. I bought it and read it 6 times. And when the other 3 books came out when I was still in college, I read those too, but I read those 3 times. I mean, I liked it. Everybody did. But you know what? I was always fascinated with fantasy and horror and sci-fi novels anyway. So this book was just like, cool. It was great. I grew up reading Stephen King novels mostly. I read Jurassic Park. I read Dracula. Charlene Harris novels, The Hobbit, The Time Machine. And besides fantasy, sci-fi, and horror novels, I was and still am a big fan of V.C. Andrews. V.C. Andrews is the best. Flowers in the Attic, that book is totally like beyond cool. That's not fantasy sci-fi, as you know, but gothic horror drama, I guess. And I also loved Anne Rice books growing up, and I still do. The Vampire Lestat, Interview with the Vampire, and many more I read. But growing up, I could never really find any good werewolf novels to read, but I would devour any book with werewolves in them, no matter the content. So when Twilight the book came out, it was such a breath of fresh air, and a little bit I was like, okay, cool, this is so great. So while I was in the middle of reading these Twilight books, I was also in the middle of class trying to write a short film. And at the same time, I was also working on a La Llorona short story that now I completed as a feature script all the way back in 2017. I have it sitting around uh, collecting dust right now, but soon I'll get some money behind it and get some backing for it one day. But anyway, at that time, I didn't want to use that. I didn't want to write that as a screenplay yet. So I kept that. And so I was thinking what else I wanted to write about, and thought, okay, I'm reading Twilight. I'm reading the Twilight series. What if I don't want to write about vampires? So what if I write about werewolves? I was always interested in wolves. I had never wrote, but the thing was, I had never wrote about werewolves before, nor vampires, and frankly, I didn't know where to start. And I knew I wanted to write about werewolves, and of course, not vampires, because it's like I said before, it's been overdone. Um, and that's when I started to plan the screenplay. And for me, it all started with planning the main character. So when I plan a story, sometimes, most of the time, the main character comes to me first. And when I planned this screenplay, that's what happened. The main character came to me first. And as I planned the main character, I planned who she was, what she was lacking, not necessarily what she wanted, but what she didn't want. And that's weird for me because usually I don't plan it that way. But at this point in time, I did. I was like, okay, what she don't want, I'll plan it that way. So my main character in this story at the time, she was turning 18 and hated school. She didn't know what she wanted to do with the rest of her life, but she did know she didn't want to be a nurse like her mother or stay living in her small hamlet mountain town, helping to raise her 4-year-old sister who took ballet. So there you go. 3 characters with a little bit of conflict I could start writing from. But the thing was, I was still faced with the question of how I was going to add werewolves into the mix. And I told myself I needed to figure it out and find out before I even continued anything. So I stopped writing from like maybe a week or two. And so as I thought, I would think about stuff on my lunch break and stuff. And then as I thought, I was like, okay, maybe the werewolves are after her for some reason. And I wrote from there, and eventually it changed over to her father was a werewolf, but he is nowhere to be found for her to ask him why the werewolves are after her, and she comes to find out that she must defeat her uncle, the alpha of the pack, and step up and become alpha herself after one of the other werewolves of the pack warns her about her uncle. In the script, she defeats her uncle, but frets over and tries to turn away, becoming the alpha. But soon realizes that she must become the alpha, and she goes away with the pack and leaves her mother and sister with just a note. And that's how I did it. And that was the end. There it went, a simple 20-minute screenplay about werewolves. But for me, in what I call the pre-draft, there was no howling at the moon. I took that out of it. No silver bullet, I took that out of it. And, you know, everybody laughed at me, about how I didn't add that into my. It's like, what is this, a joke? They laughed at me. But for some people and myself, the screenplay worked. The screenplay had a clear act 1, Act 2, Act 3 was a clear setup, inciting incident, turning point, and point of no return. All the bells and whistles of a screenplay structure. So I was like, okay, great. So I went to my professor for advice on how to expand it. I couldn't let the story go, so I decided from that 20-minute screenplay to write a novel based on it. I went to work and started my research for my novel in 2008. And when I did this research, so I was like, I have to let my main character go for a while and the story go completely for a while. But I told myself I will come back to her. And so at that point, I still didn't know how I was going to expand the story. I just started researching werewolf mythology. And within all the research, I X'd out all the werewolf mythologies that I did not want. And that was most of them. I started to go back to the basics, like what many do with vampires. I wanted my werewolf mythology strong, different. I didn't want them howling at the moon. I didn't want them attached to any kind of silver as a weakness or wolfbane as a weakness. I wanted to know where they came from. How did they become? And so what I did was, instead of researching werewolves, I started researching regular wolves. I researched all culture mythologies pertaining to just wolves. Everything. I just regular wolves, their diets, their habits, the different types of wolves, their different types of names. And one book that intrigued me for my take on my werewolves was Rudyard Kipling. Y'all have heard of the Jungle Book. Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. Well, he wrote a poem called The Law of the Jungle, and that poem was in the Jungle Book. And well, that poem, I loved it. I devoured that poem and read it over and over again. And my drafts are heavily based on that poem. And I love that poem. And maybe y'all should read it. It's a really good poem. It's called The Law of the Jungle. Well, I also did research about the moon and astrological phenomenons, but instead of using the moon like so many others, I concentrated and researched about the sun, twilight, and the northern lights, and the blue hour. And that's how I came up with my title, During the Blue Hour. So after reading Kipling and compiling my research, I decided to write a novella or prequel that I have not yet published about the origins of wolves and werewolves. This is where most of my characters come from that are in my updated versions of my work in progress. Most of these characters are my main characters' ancestors or friends' ancestors, but it took me a moment to figure out and connect the dots to see where those characters mattered to her in her story. It took me a long moment, maybe a year or so, and I'll explain that in a bit. But there you go. That was my first ever draft, but second pre-draft of where and what I wanted my werewolves to be and how I wanted them to be. Between 2009 and 2011, I was so busy with life and other writing projects that I would go back and forth between the first pages of During the Blue Hour and rewrite them without knowing some of the characters. So I decided, after writing 5 plays for the Girl Scouts and the children's theater I worked for near my college, to sit down and finally start getting serious about During the Blue Hour. So with only the prequel written and newly found title to the first book, I started breaking down the characters from my novella in 2012 and made a timeline of events all the way up to the first book, just mainly all the main plot points I wanted in the first book. I created what screenwriting they call a show Bible and compiled it all together on one note in between mapping out and plotting. I researched the world and setting of the book as well. I knew I wanted my setting where the main character lived to be somewhere in the mountains and then around snow, so I made up a name and based the location on Alaska and Canada, I combined those locations, and also ancient locations that the characters will visit in the main book from there. And then from there, I wrote character bios for each and every character, including minor characters, and focused a lot of writing character bios for the villains and broke down why they were or weren't really villains or evil. Once I knew how I had all the goals of the villains down and their quirks and their wants and needs. I started on the main character and her immediate family, and from there connected the main family tree, connecting the characters to each and every body in some other way. From there, I did character interviews for all the main characters. So after all, I went to the next step of my research and concentrated on the physiology of the werewolves. For this, I went to an actual wetland and saw some real wolves in person for the first time ever. And I got some great information from that. I took that and oh my god, it was so intriguing to see these wolves up in person, you know? And they oh my god, they were really big and it was kind of scary, but yet it was really intriguing. And I have some great ideas and I put that in my drafts of how that experience really helped me. I was glad to go and see these wolves. And like I said, these wolves were really, really big. If you ever see a wolf in person, I never imagined they would be bigger than a regular dog. And oh my god, but it was interesting and I got some really good information off of it. Well, with all this research, it took a year, and I started writing the first draft into the following year and completed the first draft on Memorial Day 2013. I worked on the first draft every day, a little bit every day, maybe 3 to 4 hours every day. Yeah, I went back and forth with it. First, I wrote it down in I wrote in a little journal. I wrote in a little journal, and I then typed it all up. Like sometimes, like my writing habits, like sometimes I have to write it out to and then type it up. But then as I typed it up, things started to change from what I wrote, and that was pretty interesting. So yeah, it took me a year to finish, and I was surprised. Like I guess I don't know. Sometimes I can go. I'm gonna do an episode about that. Another episode about that too. How long does it take you to finish a draft, and and go deeper into explaining my process in that year. But that first draft, like I said, I completed it on Memorial Day 2013, and so I completed it with 70,000 words, around 275 pages, and third person limited. It had 20 chapters, including a prologue with an epilogue. Each chapter contained a title, and it had multiple POV with 4 characters. I had the main character, her 2 love interests, and one of the villains. So after I completed the first draft, I put that draft away for a while, like 2 weeks, and then began my revision into the second draft. And that's where I'm at now because I stopped working on During the Blue Hour for a long while, but wrote another screenplay, this time a 1 hour pilot based on the first draft. And I also wrote like 3 short stories based off the first draft as well, in the some of the characters. I don't know why I didn't go back to my second draft. I guess I was like, I wanted to explore the other characters too. At this point in time, right now, where I want to get this book done, and it's like I'm ready for publication. I want to get it out there for everybody to read. I'm still taking my time with it. You know, I want it to be perfect for everybody. So, and yeah, to sum up the first draft, the main premise from the 20-minute screenplay, I did keep it. I cut out the uncle who was the alpha. I cut out his character, and my main character's ancestor is after her instead of the uncle character because of a prophecy foretold in my prequel. And when I decided to publish my prequel, y'all will really understand the prophecy and know what I'm talking about. But I'm not gonna get into that right now. So I aged the sister up to maybe 3 years younger than my main character instead of her sister being into ballet. My main character is into ballet instead. And her ballet dancing is what drives the main character from getting out of her town but in a way is also her curse. It makes her transform into her werewolf, and that's gonna get her into some trouble. And I'm gonna get more into that in other episodes and tell you more about it. And it's really interesting how I did that. Also, in my novel, do not call them werewolves. I do not call them werewolves. Through my research, I came up with another name for them. I'll go more into that in another episode as well when I break down the hierarchies of my packs. In these next episodes, episode 2, I will start breaking down and going deeper into how I chose my characters, how I explored their backstories and family trees. So far, this is my journey through my first draft, and as you can see, I did a whole lot of planning and world building, and it took a while. I want to know how you plan your stories. What methods do you use to plan and research your work in progress? Have you completed the first draft of your work in progress? Where do you stand on Werewolf Mythology? Tell me a little bit about Werewolf Mythology. I want to have a conversation about it, so let me know in the comments below. Let's start a dialogue about it. I want to know all y'all interest about Werewolf Mythology. So if you liked this first episode and you want to tune in to next week's episode, subscribe, download, share the episode. So yeah, this is my first podcast, everybody, and I want to thank y'all for listening, and hopefully I'll see you next week. And once again, make sure you subscribe. Okay, bye.